Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Tin, and as a guest, we have Jeremy. Today, we're joined by him, a global leader in API security. As the founder of FireTail.io, Jeremy's journey spans leadership positions at Rapid7, DivvyCloud, and AWS across Southeast Asia. Get ready for some insight from someone who lived and worked around the world. So tell us, what do you think will be the best impact of AI on today's society?
Ooh, great one. I tend to focus on cybersecurity because that's where I spend my days. Personally, I think there could be some really interesting stuff around automating a lot of kind of like online transactions that are a bit of a hassle that you go through regularly. So let's say you're, booking a trip or something like that, and you end up having to do like plane plus hotel plus rental car. Automating little tasks like that, I think could be a real nice boost on the personal productivity side. But in terms of cybersecurity, I tend to think of the types of things that are high volume, repetitive tasks with kind of semi-structured or semi-regular data sources. So if you think about things that we do regularly in cybersecurity, you think about like log analysis, or you think about log collection even. A lot of that kind of stuff, it's the same task over and over again with slightly different scope and slightly different systems, but you're generally trying to do the same thing again and again. And that's something that AI is very good at, right? So when you give kind of predictable data inputs, you can get predictable data outputs. And that can be a real like productivity boost for a lot of cybersecurity tasks and kind of like things that you have to do on a regular basis.
That's true. So based on our previous conversation before we started recording and all the notes that I got, you lived in 5 countries and
Yep.
speak 5 different languages
Yeah.
and worked and studied internationally. What do you believe that experience has personally shaped your worldview and your approach to leadership
Yeah.
and understanding the different cultures in the tech industry?
I think above all is the ability to adapt and to kind of not make a lot of assumptions as you go into a new situation, but being very open to kind of observing and learning from things around you. And I give you an example of what I mean there. So as you said, I've lived in a bunch of different countries and worked in a few. So I've worked in the US, Germany, and Singapore. Two of the countries that I've lived in, Finland and France, I never worked in. But in those 3 locations, the work style is very different. And what I mean by that is it's almost every aspect of how a company operates. Everything from, let's say, like leadership styles to how decisions get made, to how budget gets allocated, to how, let's say, like employee and manager relationships work. All of them are different. And if you go into any situation trying to bring the norms of where you came from, it can lead to some pretty bad results. If I went to Germany and I tried to behave like an American manager, I think I would very quickly find above all that the kind of employee manager relationship is extremely different and wouldn't work very well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. And so that is above all the number one thing that I say to people. It's like, well, how is it different? Well, it's really different in the way organizations work above all. Yes, there may be some differences in terms of, let's say, level of technical sophistication in this or that. And by the way, it's not always the case that the US is ahead of these other markets, right? So I have a number of friends in Finland who work in mobile games, and the mobile game industry in Finland is way ahead of the US,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Like Clash of Clans, Angry Birds, all of these came out of Finland, right?
Oh, okay.
And
I didn't know that. That's good to
most
know.
people don't, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, it doesn't really matter. You make a product for a global market, right? But my point is, if you go in with a lot of assumptions, you're likely to be wrong on at least some of them. And then you're likely to have some culture clash that doesn't serve you well.
Yeah. I can imagine because coming from Canada and working in the US, there's a little bit of difference, but because we're neighbors, so the culture sort of meshes a little bit. But I guess because I'm from Quebec, right?
Right.
So the French speaking part of Canada. So the language barriers that they have and that also, have you experienced that in Singapore?
So in Singapore, thankfully, the working language is primarily English. And
Yeah.
so, didn't really have too much. It's a former British colony. And so you didn't really have too much on the language barrier side, cultural barrier side for sure. In Singapore, it's kind of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual society. There are some little frictions here and there between the not so much between the groups, but in terms of how perception is around certain, let's say certain companies or certain industries and so on. And so that, you have to watch out for. Thankfully, on the working language side, that was pretty okay to navigate.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Now, here's another question. How the rapid adoption of AI is
Yep.
significantly increasing API usage, right? At the API layer is increasingly becoming a top target for attackers. What specific AI-driven threats or security gaps related to API does FireTail aim to solve? And how is it unique hybrid approach address these challenges?
Okay. So there's a lot there. So I want to
Yeah.
go through this in a few steps. So
Okay.
let me start with kind of the first part of the question, which is, that AI adoption is driving API adoption. And I think that's not something that a lot of people understand. But if you want proof of this, if you're curious, in your web browser, go into tools and then developer tools, and you'll find something called the developer console. And if you want to understand just how much API interaction is going on, just open up ChatGPT, have this developer console open, and just type in some prompts. Just ask some questions, say some things, tell me hello world, ask questions about the weather, the time of day, whatever you want to do. And what you're going to see in the developer console is that what you're typing into the web browser is actually being transmitted from your web browser to the back end of ChatGPT via API.
Okay.
And so just to start off with, basically all AI interactions go through APIs, even directly to the provider. So that's just to kind of frame the context around this. And I think that point on its own is not super well understood. But let's get beyond that. So I was at RSA conference last week, and I had a conversation with a cybersecurity analyst who works for one of the research firms. And we were talking about AI adoption and how that is changing things. And he made a very good point to me that there's really kind of two categories of AI adoption right now. And he had a great label for this, and I can't take credit. It's his terms, not mine. So Fernando Montenegro, shout out to you for coming up with this. I think it's a really, really intuitive way of thinking about AI adoption. So there's what he called workload adoption, and then workforce adoption. Workload adoption is when I take an application that I'm doing something with. So something like, let's say, cybersecurity log analysis. So I have some piece of software that analyzes logs. And what I do is I hook up the back end of that application to an LLM. And I say, hey, LLM, make this process more effective for me, or classify these log files, or look for an anomaly in this log stream, or whatever. So I've got a software application that's hooked up to an LLM. So that's a workload. So an application you can think of as a workload. So again, that connection is going to be over an API. And then there's the workforce side of it, which is what we just talked about a minute ago, which is you in your web browser over ChatGPT, right? So members of the workforce that are interacting with LLMs. And all of them are, I think, generally speaking, trying to do the right things, but possibly breaking kind of cybersecurity rules as they go. Yeah. They're trying to do their jobs more effectively, and they may or may not be uploading documents that they shouldn't be. They may or may not be copy pasting data that they shouldn't be pasting in there for various purposes. Like your manager gives you a 20-page, internal report and says, hey, I need a summary of this. Do you A, read it, or B, you're under a super tight deadline. You've got 15 minutes to try to turn it, copy paste the whole thing, right? Like it happens, right? Yeah. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying it happens. So we already talked about that side being API driven, this side being API driven. So let's focus on the workload side of things, because this is where the API risk connected to AI is happening. Okay. So what we have tended to see in cybersecurity for a long time, and I'm sure you've seen this yourself as well, new technologies come around, business gets excited about the possibility of what this new technology can do for the organization. So they tell the software developers, go, get it done. Do something cool, experiment, play around, whatever, right? Make this thing 5 times better, whatever the language is, right? As they go through that process, one of the things that often gets skipped in that step is, and involves security to make sure that as you're building out this new experimental thing, you're not leaking data or exposing things or whatever, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so that is the overall condition that leads to the risk, okay? So what is the specific risk around APIs? So this is where things get, in my opinion, very interesting. Developers have been bad at APIs for a long time now. And I don't mean to hate on our developer friends, but this has been a fact. And if you want evidence of this, you can go on the FireTail website, go down to the footer. There is a link in the footer to the API data breach tracker, where we've been tabulating a list of all the publicly disclosed data breaches on APIs for the last several years. General rule of thumb, for every disclosed breach, there's like 9 more that never get talked about.
Yeah.
right? So at best, this is a sampling of things that have happened, right? When you look at that list of breaches, what you will find is that time and again, the problem is something in the design of the application that is flawed. So it
That makes
is
sense.
like a logical flaw, like, hey, Thin Green is not supposed to be able to access this data, but oh, the API didn't check the permissions when we made the request to the database. That kind of thing. So that's where the risk really kind of like converges. So you've got this rapid development using this AI, building things over APIs without security controls around the APIs that are powering the applications or the interactions. And that's everything from like, make this call to the LLM to share this data with the LLM. And we've already seen this start to happen. We've had at least 4 or 5 off the top of my head in just the last 3-4 months where APIs have been found vulnerable on applications that are connected to LLMs. And they have led to both data leakages and abuse of the application. And I can give you one real world example to kind of make it concrete. And it is from actually OpenAI themselves. So they had an API for indexing websites because one of the things you may want to do is, what corporate websites can be big. There's a lot of content on corporate websites. So you might actually need help searching your own website to understand how your company does X or Y thing or whatever it is, right? And so you ask ChatGPT, hey, ChatGPT, please tell me FireTail's privacy policy. For instance, summarize it in 5 bullet points. ChatGPT is quite good at that. But it had to index the FireTail website to go do that. So there's this API where you can tell ChatGPT, please index my website. Okay. But you could also tell it, please index somebody else's website. And you could also tell it, please index somebody else's website 10,000 times. And the result of that is that it would take that 10,000 request of indexing, Thin Green website. It would parallelize that and send 5 requests per second. And what that would do is knock your website offline because of this flood of traffic from the OpenAI web crawler. Right. So that is what we call a function abuse on where you call an API to invoke a function, and that has the negative consequence. So that's one concrete example. But hopefully, I know that's kind of a long answer, drawing the connections between the points. But hopefully the audience is still with us and understands kind of what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah. Well, let's switch it up a little bit. You were talking about the FireTail website. You guys have recently released an annual report called "The State of AI and API Security 2025," which
Yep.
revealed that the API layer as a critical blind spot for enterprises securing their AI investments. So beyond identifying the API layer as a blind spot, what were some of the critical or surprising findings from this report that organizations need to be aware of regarding the over evolving AI threats?
Yeah, there's a couple things that really jump out in my mind. And number one is last year we saw the first regulator crack down on a company for API security breaches.
Oh,
And if you think about regulated industries, and primarily you're thinking about the industries that have some kind of like government oversight of an entire industry, like, banks are the most obvious example of this. Governments themselves, of course, have oversight.
right.
But there's a few more that people don't really think about. Insurance is another regulated space. If you have to get approval to enter an industry, that's a good example of, or a good indicator that's a regulated industry. Healthcare, telecommunications, these are often, some of the others. The first one last year was around telecommunications. So there was a division of Verizon that got their kind of wrist slapped by the regulators saying, hey guys, you've had 3 breaches on APIs in the last, I think it was like 8 months or 12 months or something that they'd had the breaches identified. And the regulator said, you're not doing a good enough job of API security. You get hit with this regulatory fine. And I can't remember how big the fine was, but it was real money. And then also you have to shape up, right? You have to do better with your API security. This is not a surprise so much. The surprise is that there's actually not regulatory standards that companies have to adhere to. Usually when a technology starts to get cited by regulators as like, hey, this is a real risk for you. And think about other things that are regulated that have cybersecurity controls. So you think about like encryption, you think about like network traffic. There are prescriptive controls. If you want to be HIPAA, you want to operate in healthcare, you have to comply with HIPAA. You've got controls around how you handle data, around how you store data. You must encrypt. Your encryption has to be the following standards. You must have, kind of secure communications over your networks using like TLS, SSL, these types of things, right? Nothing around APIs. So that is still a surprise in my mind because we're several years into APIs being a very, very prominent attack surface. So that's one. Number two is I'm not so much surprised, but I'm surprised that more organizations aren't crying about the problem. We analyzed a bunch of API traffic and requests, and what we found that only 40% of these requests are actually successful. So what this means is 60% of all API requests fail. Now, some of that is like developer error. I misconfigured some API call that I'm in my application that is talking to this service or that service or whatever. That's fine. A lot of it is bots, and like a lot is bots. But the net result to the customer is that they're paying for 60% more compute power to run the APIs than they legitimately need. And that's actually a big waste factor. It's like less of a cybersecurity risk because they've got, if they've got some good controls on their APIs, then, they could be in reasonable shape and these bots are just going to fail all their requests. That's kind of understood and accepted. But man, they're wasting a lot of money running APIs. And that was something that really caught me by surprise. I couldn't believe just how little traffic was actually being successful. So that was pretty interesting to find. There were a number of breaches last year. None of them were particularly surprising. We saw more of the same. The breach data has followed pretty similar trend lines for the last couple of years. That has stayed roughly the same. Authentication and authorization continue to be kind of the top two problems. Nothing really has changed there. But those other points that I mentioned were kind of the most surprising things. There's one more that I'll highlight. And by the way, the report is freely available on our website. We also track kind of what we categorize as risky countries. And, just in the case of FireTail, for most of our customers, that does end up being kind of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, et cetera. What we saw in traffic from those countries was that it followed the same patterns, and those patterns changed from month to month. And so one of the things, and that was really interesting to watch. And one of the things that told us is that whether there's explicit communication, we don't know. But whether they are following the same kind of, let's say, forums where exploits for certain vulnerabilities are being released or publicized or talked about, that seems more likely. And so it's if you remember a couple years back, you remember something called Log4Shell? Yeah. So when that got published around, hey, there's this big vulnerability in this Log4j thing. And, if it's out there, oh crap, you got to patch right away. Similar kind of thing. So the traffic patterns very much matched. Oh, there's some exploits and vulnerabilities around these things. And so we saw the traffic from those kind of risky countries following the same, making the same requests. Yeah. And it changed from month to month to month. In particular, there was one 3-month stretch, November, December, January, where we really saw it crystal clear.
That's interesting. And do you think that it would be something related to maybe some of the holidays, right?
I think, holidays are a likely contributing factor. So, a lot of business gets done at that time period, whether it's B2B or whether it's Christmas shopping, right? And so what that means is okay, all the retailers, the e-commerce sites, et cetera, they have to move really quick. Oh crap, more Christmas shopping, more business, whatever. So they put a lot of extra infrastructure online. And whenever businesses move very, very quickly, there's a risk that security gets overlooked as part of that process, right? So I do think there is probably some connection to the holidays.
Yeah. Especially in the US, because in the US, if you look at the holiday calendar, it seems like there's a holiday every month.
Yeah.
But the big ones are July, November, December, February, and then May, June, maybe because of Mother's Day, Father's Day. So the month variation, I can understand it a correlation with the holidays. But I'm not sure for the different countries as they don't have the same holidays as us. But
yeah,
it makes sense that different months have the variation as you stated.
Yeah.
So on your podcast, Modern Cyber, where you discuss topics like AI and API security with your guests, what do you personally find most rewarding or interesting about hosting these conversations? And has anything a guest has shared profoundly changed your perspective on cybersecurity or AI?
The second question is the harder one to answer, which is why I'm thinking for a second. But the first part is very easy. So I tell people I actually gain the most from running the podcast. we do it to spread awareness. We do it to share lessons learned and all those things.
Right.
The common thread is that I'm on basically every episode. So I get to hear what all the guests have to share and I get to learn from them. I get the most, in my opinion, out of the whole exercise of hosting the podcast. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy the conversations. I find that the cybersecurity community is one of people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing for their customers. That is almost universally true. I don't know that I've met anybody in the cybersecurity industry, with the exception of a few salespeople who come to mind, who is not trying to do the right thing for their customers and trying to genuinely protect systems and protect data and so on, right? So I really enjoy the conversations and I learn, like genuinely learn from that. So that's the easier part of the question, like I said. As far as what's changed my perspective, recently we've been running this breach series where we have guests on to talk about the worst cybersecurity breach that they ever personally went through. And that has been fascinating. We've had a couple of ransomware conversations for different types of organizations, and I think we've had 3 of them now about ransomware, and no 2 of them were the same. But what was interesting was that a lot of the emphasis on what could have been done better goes back to like basics. And that has been something where it has been a good reminder for me that like we work on something that I think is very cutting edge. APIs are new to a lot of organizations and AI is new to everybody, right? So we work on this like fancy new stuff that is super interesting for us to work on, delivers a lot of value to our customers, but at the same time, like you cannot forget the basics. And when I say basics, I mean just like, hey, do we have logging turned on in the places that we need it turned on?
Right.
Are we running our backups? Are we checking our backups? Are we following good rules around backups? Like, I don't know if you've ever heard the 3-2-1 rule of backups. You have 3 copies of a backup on 2 different media. So one could be on like, used to be that we use tape drives and DVDs. Nowadays, I would say it's
Wow.
probably just like, yeah, I'm dating myself a little bit. But, nowadays I would say it's probably more like, just 2 different media, one being local, one being remote or something like that. And then 1 copy in a remote location that is like disconnected from all of your production environment, so that when things really go bad and I don't know, some like ransomware or worm or malware is spreading across your systems, you've got a backup that's intact, in good shape, and it's completely like untouchable by this thing. So that has been a really good reminder. Like the new stuff is awesome, but the basics are still super, super important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because like I heard a story where there was a backup in place, right? But it was never tested.
Yeah.
And come to find out that the backup took longer. So it took more than 24 hours.
Yeah.
And then at 24 hours, it would stop and then start a new backup. So you'll never get the right
A complete backup. Yeah.
complete backup. So
Yeah.
yeah, the backups, like testing the backups is always something like, it's like brushing your teeth
Yeah.
almost, right?
Yeah. No, and a
You
lot
gotta
of people,
test that.
totally, a lot of people will talk about this as like basic cyber hygiene.
Yeah.
You got to do these things. By the way, I've lived through exactly what you said, both in terms of the backup that takes more than 24 hours and in terms of the backup that was never tested. And in our case, we had 1 tape that went bad and we had this automatic tape changer, massive physical hardware device like this big and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I think inside, if I remember right, it had 24 tapes and it had this automated way of just like rotating through the tapes. And it knew like, okay, a tape got full, whatever. And it had this design where it would spread a backup across 4 tapes.
Okay.
And there were reasons for that I don't really remember off the top of my head. I can't remember if it was just too big or if it was like for resiliency purpose or something like that. But one of our tapes went bad, just physically went bad, like the tape itself like wore thin or something like that.
Oh man.
And we had a Microsoft Exchange email server that crashed, and we lost about a week and a half of people's emails because we never checked our backups, never tested
I
them.
can imagine the riots you guys got.
It's funny. Earlier today, I was listening to another podcast, and on there, the host said something like to the effect of there are 2 types of IT admins: those who have taken down a production server and liars. And so like, I've been there. I've taken down prod. I've lost a week's worth of data. I once deleted our entire customer database by accident. Thankfully, in that case, we did have a good backup.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I broke many things too. So I'm not. Yeah, it happens.
It does.
So 2 more questions. The next question is, what do you use AI for today?
Yeah. A couple of things. I do some of the personal productivity stuff. I do a lot of report summarization. One of the things that I think is my job as, as kind of CEO and leader of FireTail is staying ahead of what's going on across the industry. So not just focusing on FireTail, but also understanding like what are some of the other annual reports? Like in right now, this time of year, especially with the RSA conference, lots of organizations publish reports and a lot of them
Yeah.
have really good, useful information in them. But, I downloaded one of them the other day that I love. It's the Verizon DBIR, the Data Breach Index report or something like that. And it's one that I've been looking at for years, but it's like 90 pages. And, sometimes I really just need to understand a few key sections of it. So I absolutely do some of the personal productivity stuff
Yeah.
around that and trying to make best use of my time to summarize data. And the other stuff is we're definitely building things into our product that are, again, kind of along the lines of what we talked about at the very beginning of the discussion today around automating and improving the automation of some kind of repetitive tasks with regularly structured data. So there's some stuff that we're working on over on that side. We're not quite ready to announce yet, but we're very excited about the things that we're doing there that I think are really, really cool. There's a few other small things here and there, a little bit of like coding assistance our team uses on things like that. But those are kind of the primary use cases right now.
Something like I would do.
Yeah.
I would do also like the personal, summarization of reports or even, emails
Yeah.
and stuff like that because hey,
Yeah.
I'm a ticking,
Yeah, exactly.
right? All right. So as the last question that I would like to ask you is if you were a superhero and you
Yeah.
had a superpower, what would it be?
Wow, tough one. The classic is to go invisibility or the ability to fly, right? But I don't
Yeah.
think I would go with either of those, to be honest. Airplanes work perfectly well, and invisibility is not really something that particularly interests me. Power of prediction would be probably my number one. The
Okay.
ability to kind of see what's coming next. Like technology moves really fast, and there's a couple of things that I've heard over the years, and I may get them wrong, but there's one that's always like if you listen to the analyst firms, they're directionally correct, but they always get the timescales wrong. And then if you listen to the futurists, they tend to think that the tech is coming sooner than it actually comes, but then they underestimate the impact on society. And so if you could find a way to kind of like
Be in the middle.
yeah, be somewhere in the middle or let's say like get the timing and the impact right. That could be really impactful, right? And you could make great decisions about what you wanted to do with both your personal life and your professional life if you kind of know how things are going to go. Whether you really need to buy that doomsday property in New Zealand to run away to if World War III runs. I mean, I'm kind of joking, but like, I think prediction at the end of it would be what
Prediction.
I would choose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm out of questions.
Awesome.
Was there anything that you wanted to share with us today that you didn't get to share?
No, I think we covered a lot of stuff. API security, obviously, we think is super important. We think it's also bringing an additional risk around AI to organizations, as we talked about a little bit about the connection there. And one of the things that we are really focused on in the next couple of months here is trying to solve for AI one of the problems that we help our customers solve for APIs, which is just knowing what's going on. And security teams in general, like you have to start somewhere. And usually you need to start from knowing about what's happening. There's something that I've heard over the years, like if you can't see it, you can't defend it.
Right. That's true.
So we have some really interesting stuff coming in the AI discovery area that we're really excited about. So as we record right now, I'd say we're about 3 to 4 weeks away from announcing that publicly and opening that platform up. If anybody wants to kind of learn more about it, they should just come to firetail.io and just sign up. You can sign up for free, no credit card required, and you'll be in the system for when this stuff drops and be able to access it first. And I think it'll really deliver a lot of value to organizations.
That's awesome. Looking forward to it. All right, boys and girls. This is it, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.